Hello, everybody. This is very improvised, and it was intended to be improvised because I came here to learn from you, and I'm trying to reciprocate. And the reason is because one of the things my team and I do around the world, as we talked about before, is recognize, discover property rights, record them, and make them accomplish a whole bunch of functions. And one of the reasons they've allowed me to talk to you without asking questions, but based on images, was because, and conversations that I've just held now, the question was, how do we use modern technology, which you're very familiar with, your blockchainers, your people of the developed world, to do better what we basically do with very simple computing. And the question, since lunchtime that I've been talking with a lot of you, the question has been, well, yes, but how do you pick up information in areas such as developing in many former communist countries where we don't have records of who owns what? How do you know that? And so I found that it's very difficult to transmit the fact that the information you need to know where minerals, who runs or controls minerals, who lives where, who owns the river, who really has the topsoil in Peru, in Mongolia, where in Kazakhstan, where there's a lot of minerals, for example, or a lot of resources, and there are people sitting on top of them, and you've got to deal with them if you want to get to these minerals. And, which is very important, if we're 8 billion people in the world, when I'm talking to you about areas where we don't really know who owns what, we're talking about 5 billion people. And we're sitting on top of most of the rare minerals in the world. And if you look at the map, that's where the wars are taking place. And it's all about resources and it's all about boundaries. So the question is, how do you find out who's really in control in these different parts of the world, which sound to probably like many Americans like an Indiana Jones film, which is how do you discover who is where and who got lost and who got kidnapped? How do you get that? So one of the difficult tasks that I've been challenged with, as I talk to many of you, is how do you know? And the reply is it's very simple. Humans, even like mammals, wherever they live, they actually clearly establish where the boundaries are. And it's a question of simply knowing how to read this. And the first time I met that challenge was when I visited Indonesia many moons ago, say 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And I was walking around Bali, which is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. It's one of the islands in Indonesia. And I was called in by the head of state that at the time was a General Suharto, who said, look, we've read your book, we've read your stuff, and we'd like to hire you because we have 92% of the authority and we don't really know who controls it in real terms. And so tell me, Mr. De Soto, how is it that we can find out who owns what in Indonesia? Now, I had learned at that time that if you don't tell a head of state what he needs right from the beginning, the first 5 minutes, you're going to lose him because he doesn't have time to waste on you. And so the meeting will be over in 5 minutes. If you tell him what he wants to know, then he will stick around for the next 1 or 2 hours, and then we had a contract. So I had told him, look, and it just came to my mind. I said, look, the idea is that most of Indonesia is communal. It's different communities that organize everything. That's right. There is no private property. Well, I said, I want to challenge that. Because when I've been in Bali, beautiful place, walking up and down the different shelves, I noticed that roughly every 300 or 400 yards, a different dog would bark. And they will bark only to the boundary of where the owners are. So what you have to do is recruit Indonesian dogs, and they'll tell you who owns what. He laughed, and we got the contract. Now, we weren't able to fulfill the contract because he got ousted some months later. But the reply is, of course, you don't ask the dogs. But the reply is that there's always signs. And when I get that kind of question from the United States, from Americans, of course, I think maybe they don't read history. When the United States declares independence, and we looked at this part of American history with great detail, subjects which don't interest many people, most of North America, when you had your independence, was up in the Northeast. What the United States decided to do, however, was grow, kick out the Spaniards, kick out the French, kick out the Mexicans, and go all the way to California. Now, as they brought in 36 million immigrants from Europe, the question was, how do you give them land? And the reply was, go west, young man, and we will start the homesteading, or what are called the preemption acts. Now, how did you decide who owns what? Well, what happened was that in each case, the local authorities decided that in Oklahoma, it was the Corn Bill of Rights, which is whoever went in someplace and started planting corn, his property was as far as the corn went. Wherever you were in forests, and I don't know, in Wyoming was a log cabin act, and it depends how many logs you had cut. And according to the logs that you had cut, that's how far, or the trees went, that's where you got your title. And in California was who squatted where regarding the gold resource. And then there was Little Miami River as well, and all of that. And those were called the Preemption Acts. And there were 22 of them. And the last one was the Homesteading Act. It was really the cherry on the ice cream. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court said that isn't valid. That isn't done according to law. That's primitive. And the U.S. Congress came out and said, those are the American people, and we believe more in them than the judges. And until today, that's the basis of your property system. And you're the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a central registry, because your title insurance, you're this, you're that. The fact that you own land in a certain way in Louisiana that isn't the way you do it in New York, etc., means that you went about it the way we developing countries are doing it. You read the signs. Right now, once you know that, then the question is, do Americans remember that? Sometimes they do. One example that we studied, but we had to go to Japan for, is what happened when, after the war, when you had a war with Japan. You had a war with Japan that went somewhere between the 1940s and the 1945. And during that time of the war, General MacArthur, who was head of the Southeastern Asian operations, said, what do we do when we win the war? Well, we have to destroy the feudal system. And
Hernando?
Yes?
Sorry. We forgot to set the presentation for you here.
Thank you.
So you can
just in time. Thank you.
Green dot.
There we go. Thank you so much, Natalie. Well, then he said, how do we do it? Because if there's a feudal system and everything belongs to the feudal lord, but that isn't true. Never in the world. There's always a local map because neighbors have to get along. So this community in the United States, which nobody has written about, the Japanese haven't written about. They were walloped with 2 atomic bombs. They don't like to record that part of history. So we went to Japan, and a Peruvian team stayed there for 2 years to talk to the octogenarians who had managed post-war Japan. No television at that time. And so what they did, they put posters. The first posters put under MacArthur when he was in Japan is the one you're seeing on the screen. Posters are an art. Maybe to somewhere like blockchain. How do you get that information there? So what you see there is what actually the Japanese were told was going to happen and did happen. They went to the few different feudal organizations and found out, as you will see in the bottom line, that everybody knew where their land was, and they even had a little map. And then they were photographed. And in the photographs, we would have somebody with a blank scarf, the photographic machine, and he would say, "I'm Fujimori. I'm such and such. I'm such and such. This is my land from fence to fence. This is my business from wall to wall. This is it." They were all photographed. There they are, pointing up. Then the heads of the non-feudal lords, but the people were below, who are the second line from the bottom, then explained to the third line, which are the bureaucracies, what the rules for the property were, which were then written down and codified, and then went up to the emperor, and that's modern Japan. At that time, Peru had a GNP per capita twice the size of Japan. That's why we have a lot of Japanese. We're the second Japanese colony in the world. We even had a Japanese president. And they were poor. 15 years after this happened, Japan had 11 times the GNP of Peru. So property did its work. When you have boundaries, you're able to recognize a whole bunch of things. If you look at the very cells of your body, you will find that the action of the cell is always in the boundary. That's where you filter out what comes in and what goes out. When you don't have a boundary, you don't have life. That's what Darwin said. How did life begin? He said, in a warm little pond, where you have some kind of a boundary and it's quiet, and then life gets organized into a protein. So the question is, this is, by the way, this isn't about being scientific. What I'm trying to respond is to my blockchain friends that what I need is for your blockchain technologies, which we know something about, not as much as you, how you can use it in most of the world to actually do something more interesting than even certifying or tokenizing property in the United States. There's a lot more money involved. There's a lot more at stake. And that there are always signs. And it's an art that we have lost. So the next thing that we did is, when we learned all of this, we applied it to Peru. And Peru was in a mess. We had wars with guerrilla and everything. And we went out and recorded, like what we learned from the Japanese. We codified into Roman law, and we put in new businesses, and we registered 340,000 businesses in 3 years, and we became the highest developing country in Latin America. Bang, bang, bang. No foreign markets, just on internal. So the value of the assets went up. Like I told you in the previous conference, that when we were in Peru, when we sold the telephone company, and nobody would buy it from us. It was only worth $57 million. It was so poor in Peru. Once we titled it, but we put modern law into Peru that gave property signals that could be used in developed countries, because you were able to recognize the difference between one and the other. We sold the company for 37 times the value that it had before we sort of blockchained that value into the new law. So when you have boundaries, when everybody knows who's responsible and accountable for what, and you are able then to plug into what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of filaments of businesses that are invisible, and we don't really know how we work, we just know that it works. That is what Judge Holmes of the Supreme Court of the United States once defined as very important. He said that the law is the result of experience, not of theory nor technology. Once you're plugged in, all sorts of wonderful things can start happening. Then the purpose of this is only to give you images, something that can't be told another way. We get, the following thing. What are other places that we get the information? We had to fight a guerrilla in Peru, a terrorist system. And we decided, how is it that the terrorists know from the Middle East to anywhere in the world, including Peru? It was a shining path, the FARC in Colombia. How do they gain their popularity? Well, believe it or not, whether communists or not, it's because they record the property. The government doesn't know how to record because it doesn't base itself on experience, but on the law. So if you look at this, we were hired by the government to find out if our theory worked elsewhere. Well, you will see reading from right to left. Starting from the bottom, we found that the Shining Path had all the records of where poor people live in Peru. We took them away from them, we photocopied them, we legalized them, and we won the war in 6 months. The second is we try to help the Colombians. My friend President Uribe of Colombia, and we found out that all the places you live in Colombia that were coordinated by terrorists that were organized by the FARC. We were asked by General Banks Craddock to find the same thing in Afghanistan. We Peruvians went in there and found out that all the titles where you weren't able to find Al Qaeda were handed out by Al Qaeda. There you got them at the beginning. Those are titles by terrorists. If you go out to Al Qaeda, there you got the other ones, and the same thing happened in Iraq. And the Islamic State controlled all the different oases of around the place because they organized property there. What communists organizing property? Yep, communists organizing property. So if you want to keep on winning wars, Americans, as opposed to losing wars, you should go back to your 19th century and remember that the signs are there. And therefore, the challenge, whether you want to do mining, whether you want to destroy violence, whether you want to be in control or not, is learning how to connect your property rights system, your blockchain system, your recording system, the system to say the truth, with evidence that's at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, the next image is this. It's not always the terrorist thing. In Peru, we have local registries. People do it. So when you go, every time we go to a country, we say, hey, is there a chamber of commerce? Yeah. Do you have a system for recording? Yes. Is it official? No, it's the one we use. So in Peru, we've got something like 6,000 recording systems. You just go and you pick it up. So it isn't a question of how do you find things out. Just go back to 19th century America. Somewhere there, French colonials or whatever it is, has recorded it. We humans always invented it. So the challenge for the modern world, you Americans, and people like us, is how do you make the two worlds meet? And don't forget, all your wars are being fought in countries like ours. And where the Chinese are challenging you is not in Europe, it's in countries like mine. So if you adapt blockchain to that, you're not only going to solve world problems, you're also going to get rich. Everybody's going to get richer. But we've got to remember an art that was lost. And we've got to stop thinking about property rights as a right-wing philosophy. It is simply the establishment of boundaries on the basis of what people believe in. And it doesn't matter how they got there. That's what you got. And the law is what is respected. Then the next issue will be, I don't know what we have here. Yeah. What does international law have to say about it? Well, it's very simple. With a group of friends, Joe Stiglitz, an American economist and Nobel Prize winner, and a man that was head of the FAL-CIO, we were called into the International Labor Organization to say, how is it possible that all these people in the third world that are now organized all over the place don't have a property right, and international treaties don't recognize them? So we put out 2 conventions. It took us 3 years. And now they've been put into all the free trade agreements between the United States and developing countries. And the result is that it is not only legal at a national basis to recognize the assets that are invisible, it is an international obligation. In other words, there's treaties, there's conventions about it, they're international. And that's the reason why all these people in superficial world, in the third world, can, as a matter of fact, resist all of this. Now, the question is, boy, that was a hell of a presentation by Hernando. He must be an anthropologist. No, I'm not an anthropologist. We've designed the system. We have found that all of this thing that has happened throughout humanity over the last 200 years, since kingdoms fell, since imperial empires collapsed, has a sequence. And it's one certification after another. Each one reinforces the next one, which gradually gives security to who owns what, who is where, and what are the rules. So if you take a case of Peru, the territory is subsoil, which is where you get the concessions given by the state. The property titles, which I've just indicated that people on superficial do. And then in red are the way you classify for any country the stages that we've been following without knowing it, that coincide all the way from Syria to Peru. One first stage is a local stage. You've got to know who controls the territory locally, who's at the mine mouth of the uranium mine, of the copper mine, of the oil, of the uranium. And it goes on until the certificates build up. Those are the red parts. The challenge now is, how does that then get to the capital markets of the United States and Europe, where you raise the funds and the capital to create the investment capital that is necessary, and I'm finishing in about a minute or two, to create the investment that goes into funding resources in most of the world? Well, the reply to that is a very simple one. 5% of all the money found by the United States to fund investment capital comes from the Fed. That is to say, your Central Reserve Bank of the United States, 5%. The rest of the 95% comes from private banks that obey the rules of the 1933 and 1934 Fraud Acts of the United States, the purpose of which is that those who have financial privilege, the privilege to issue financing, must be able, with fund originators and underwriters, to certify that the assets which you're going to fund to develop, whether it be a city, a mine, a military resource, a transport system, are true. 95%. That's where the property titles go. So the issue is, we do it. Obviously, we do it because that's the way the world works. But it's lengthy, it's strong, it's lengthy and complicated and corrupt. That's where blockchain comes in. If your tokens reflect what is already on the ground and you can input it into blockchain, then at that moment, your capital markets will outdo the Chinese markets, will outdo just about anybody else, because what you've got to be able to do is to understand that the property titles, the big labor is in refining them in such a way that the law of the United States and anti-fraud, or the law of Western countries, recognizes that the property is solid. Because basically what you're doing is you're taking a hard asset like land, like mines, like the air, like water, and you're liquefying it. But the liquefying doesn't begin at your capital markets. It begins with the populations of 5 to 6 billion of the people in the world, where you've got most development challenges going on, where you're fighting all your wars, where the Chinese are outdoing you, and you've got to have a capitalist response to that. And the capitalist response is recognize property rights. Property rights isn't only what Trump does to make a fortune in New York. It is the solution to the issues of the world. And we are looking for partners to develop what we know into blockchain procedures, and then not only make it an interesting exercise towards the development of cyberspace, the development of digital currencies, but make it the instruments it should be, which is a great capitalist instrument that helps the poor of the world. That's it. It's just an illustration to tell you that we have to create some kind of a bridge between us and yourselves and avoid wars in areas where nobody knows who owns what. Thank you.